Hallo, hallo, hallo.
Sorry für die Umstände. Kann ich das nochmal kurz abnehmen?
Ja.
Hier auch Test, Test, Test.
Ja. Musst du hier länger machen. Oder vielleicht ist eine Schuhe, das ist einfacher, ne?
Here's another one.
Das ist easier zu handeln, aber es ist für dich unbequem wahrscheinlich.
Für die Lesung,
mit der
ne?
Käufer, ne?
So planten wir, oder? Also wenn das klappt.
Wir gucken mal. Wir probieren es jetzt noch einmal. Ein bisschen länger hier.
Hi. Was meinst du damit?
Also das heißt, wenn du sozusagen das Publikum interessierst,
Ja.
Okay, das heißt, ich soll auch da.
kannst du auch mal.
Dann 2, 3. Okay, super. Gut. Hallo, Test, Test, Test. Okay, jetzt habe ich auch. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our tonight's reading, to our reading session and to our discussion here at Doxomentale, and also hi to those watching from home. Quick reading the room. Who has felt powerless and hopeless in the recent last weeks after reading the news? Please raise your hand. Let's see. All right, almost everyone except our guest. Well, most political books and most journalistic reporting right now is about one thing: the collapse of the systems. They diagnose crises, the multi-crises of our time, and honestly, rightly so, I would say, but then they stop. And they usually leave us alone with a profound sense of hopelessness and powerlessness. Also you, as you said. So tonight, we are here to talk about a very different approach and a very different kind of book. It's published last month with Atlantic Books, and it's called Braver New World, the countries daring to do things others won't. And I am pretty sure that by the end of this evening, you will long to read the book and those kind of books and this kind of journalism. And it's great to have this conversation here in Berlin because for our guest, this city is also deeply personal. John Kampfner has spent 40 years in the front row of global politics as a foreign affairs specialist and columnist for, inter alias, The Guardian and Foreign Policy. But his deep connection to Germany started right here in 1988 when he moved. So alt. Yeah, me too, almost. When he moved to East Berlin as a young correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. He reported live as the wall came down, witnessing firsthand a defining moment of modern European history. Ever since those days, he hasn't been able to get the city out of his mind. He wrote the acclaimed bestseller, Why the Germans Do It Better. I would really like to know why, maybe we talk about this as well, followed by a 800-year biography of this city called In Search of Berlin. Today, he considers himself both a Londoner and a Berliner. So, after reporting and analyzing global politics, he decided to choose a different approach. For his 8th book, John made a radically different decision. Instead of staying with the collapse, he spent 3 years traveling 10 countries, looking for solutions and for societies that are confronting problems boldly, with courage. Maybe we're going to talk about this in particular, and with remarkable results. So, this solution-based approach is very dear to my heart. I'm Bianca Kriel. I'm a solution-based journalist for Good Impact magazine. And now, finally, a very warm welcome, John Kampfner.
Thank you very much indeed, Bianca. Is this working? Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Bianca.
Great. So, John, before we talk about your book, let's start with where we are. I said you're also a Berliner. What are your associations with this place where we are, Potsdamer Platz?
Ja, well, first of all, wenn jemand eine Frage auf Deutsch stellen will, das kann ich auch. Man könnte es auch auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch machen. Das Buch kommt erst auf Deutsch am Ende September aus und man könnte das auch lesen. Das wird auch Brave New World heißen, mit Untertitel Mutig in die Zukunft, was ich auch für toll halte. Can I just ask, how many people here are German and how many are not German? How many German? And how many not German? So it's about 50-50 in this small but perfectly formed audience. So my association is, well, as you've already said, Bianca, and congratulations on the work that you do. So I was a very young journalist here. I had the incredible good fortune of being in Berlin, in Ost-Berlin, in the Leipziger Straße, in a very nice old Stasi-Hochhaus, and seeing it all happen. And the day after Wiedervereinigung, they sent me to Moscow for 4 years, where I saw that collapse as well. Then I went back to Britain and I watched that collapse as well too. So you can see with Brexit, that wonderful Albtraum. And then I thought straight after that, I want to reawaken my association with Europe now that Britain had decided to float off into the mid-Atlantic on a little dinghy, waving a little plastic flag. And it was time to come back here. And so since about 2018, I've been back in Berlin. Also ich pendle zwischen den beiden, but most of the time I'm here.
So, as I said, you witnessed 1989 firsthand. You described it as a moment of profound optimism, a sense that history was moving into the right direction. And then for you, and it may be not only for you, something shifted. What changed exactly?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say, and I always think about this, and no offense to my many German friends, but I think the German self-criticism, which I think is a good thing in any country, all too often becomes self-flagellation, and if you look back at what happened in 1989, just for one moment, because that's not the theme of the book, I was pretty much all the time at the opposition movement in the Zionskirche, in Gethsemane-Kirche, in Prenzlauer Berg. I was in Leipzig at the Nikolaikirche all the time. And if you had told me on the morning of the 9th of November 1989, oh, the wall's going to come down today, I would have told you you were a bit crazy. Because of course there were demonstrations, of course there was Gorbachev, of course the system was looking shaky. But the GDR had already just been recognized. Erich Honecker had been welcomed with full military honors for the first time at the airport in Bonn, Köln-Bonn. And there was no reason to suggest anything would collapse. And more to the point, there was no reason to suggest that everything would collapse and not a single person would be killed. And so when I was just about a month before the wall, and I talk about this a lot in speeches, and when I was doing my book tour of In Search of Berlin, I talked about this a lot. It was a remarkable and incredible achievement that the most militarized city in the world, the most militarized place in the world, is the dividing line between North and South Korea, but the most militarized city in the world was Berlin, was divided Berlin, and the epicenter of the Cold War, and the fact that there was no rule book for what happened. As everybody remembers, it was a mistake by Günter Schabowski, what he said in the press conference. And anything could have happened. And anything could have happened in any of the demonstrations I was at. Egon Krenz had praised the Chinese Tiananmen Square solution to insurrection. And I always think that whenever Germans think about how problematic everything was and how problematic the Wende was, and there were many, many mistakes made in the Treuhand and the arrogance, beste Wessis and all of that, but it is still to separate out the micro from the macro. It was a remarkable achievement to handle the accidental collapse of one system in a city like this. And history always makes us think about inevitability and a straight line. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and therefore the fall of the regime was inevitable. It was not inevitable. It absolutely was not inevitable. And the peaceful changes that happened afterwards were not inevitable as well. So that made me optimistic, and then I went to the Soviet Union, or Moscow, the capital of what became the Russian Federation. And in those early years, I too was incredibly optimistic. I mean, of course, there were terrible things that happened, and the rise of the mafiosa and the oligarchs and the seizing of raw materials and all of that. But it was still an incredible place where freedoms were just acquired on a daily basis. So there was incredible reason to be optimistic. And then everybody since then has their own dates when they think that the optimism of a particular period started to collapse. Was it 9/11? Was it the Iraq War? Was it the financial crash of 2007? Was it the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014? Was it the election of Donald Trump in 2016? And in British terms, was it Brexit of the same year? The answer is it was perhaps all of those things, but to me it was the failure of courage. And that's the theme of this book, that I look at 10 countries, as you've mentioned, and that includes 10 cities, all of which I think are trying to tackle one of the world's problems in an incredibly interesting way, which doesn't mean they're perfect in any way. But the three virtues that I talk about in this book, which are completely transferable to Germany, to France, to Britain, the United States is maybe a different question now. I think we all feel very, very dark about the United States. But they are transferable still, and they are resilience, imagination, and courage, which I'll talk a little bit more about if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So you were talking about the optimism you felt, and which was around for many people in several countries, and then it shifted, and then you personally also became a professional pessimist. So was that the starting point for you to go and look for solutions? What happened there?
Yeah, right in the introduction of the book, that I had become a professional pessimist. I used to bet with friends, and even sometimes professional betting, on bad things happening. And the amazing thing about that is that I almost always won. The only time I got it wrong was I thought Marine Le Pen would win last time in France, and she didn't. But who knows what's going to happen next April. Anyway, I thought this is all good fun, but then I realized this is a crazy way to be. You are doing nothing constructive for the world at all. And there is so much doom talking about democratic backsliding, about the collapse of the system in which we live, which I agree with that broad headline analysis. But as far as I'm concerned, that is necessary but insufficient. That it's really important for us, all of us now, irrespective of whether you're on the left, you're in the middle, or you're in the center right, but not on the far right. It's really, really important for us all to, in some ways, oh, I hope that's not mine. It's really important for us all to remove our shibboleths, our straitjackets, and think incredibly imaginatively about the future. And all my examples are incredibly different, and they don't fit into a left-right paradigm. They fit into a paradigm of surprise and breaking down barriers. Sorry, and I'll just switch that off.
Yeah, thanks. Before you start reading a bit from the introduction, maybe to get a hold of it, how did you choose those countries? You said what they have in common, but I mean, where to start? How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, by the way, I forgot to say is that whenever I do audiences, I've been doing pretty much an event every day now for the last month in the UK and Ireland, and this is my second event here. As I always promise, now whether I succeed is up to you, but I promise to leave the audience, whether you're online or you're in the room, more optimistic and happier at the end of this session than where you started. And if I don't achieve that, then I've made a mistake, apart from persuading you to have a look at the book, if that's what you wish as well. So I spent quite a lot of time, and I was blessed with having an incredibly great researcher, thinking about which 10 countries would I want to go to. What I didn't want to do was to be predictable. Because if you look at all the lists in the United Nations, the OECD, any of the international institutions, the World Bank, you always come up with the same answers. It's always the Scandies, right? It's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and then sometimes the Dutch, quite often the Swiss, and then maybe a few other countries as well. And I really, really wanted to surprise people. So my running order, just very quickly, just so that people have an understanding of it, this isn't the order in which I visited the countries, but this is the order in which the book appears. I start off in Japan, looking at their incredible approach to social care and to the demographic time bomb that some countries are already facing and other countries very soon will face. The second country I went to was Canada, looking at their amazingly imaginative approach to managing immigration and all issues around migration. Third chapter was not a country, but a city, Vienna, looking at public housing and what has been achieved there, which is a model for Germany, for Berlin, for London, for Paris, and for so many other cities as well. Then I was in Finland looking at the education system, which is remarkable. Perhaps the most surprising chapter is the fifth chapter, which is the health service, where I could have looked at any of the more obvious Nordic countries, but I actually traveled to Taiwan, which has an unbelievably different and imaginative health service, which also, at times of financial great strain, happens to be incredibly cheap as well, which we can come to that. Then I look at two countries on the environmental agenda. I look at Costa Rica and sustainability and how they've managed to completely transform on its head what the IMF and other international bodies had told them should be the paradigm, and to have reforested and to have turned around their environmental performance completely, while at the same time increasing economic growth. So this criticism of the green movement of always requiring sacrifices, they have completely repudiated. Then I was in Morocco, which we were talking about earlier, which I did as almost as a provocation for further discussion, because it is not a democracy, because it is a monarchical, authoritarian country. It's certainly not North Korea, and it's not China, but it has a parliament and a government, but it is a sort of soft to medium authoritarian state. Then I did 2 digital countries that couldn't be more different. India, 1.3 billion people, which has gone from being, in analog terms, a country that has struggled both in terms of delivery of basic goods and services and economic livelihood to people, to absolutely transforming the lives of the poorest of the poor, the rural poor and single traders, simply by the use of certain apps, by the digitalization of the country. And then I did another digital chapter, which is Estonia, which puts countries, particularly Germany, to shame. 3,000 state services, each and every one of them you can access digitally. Now you might say, well, okay, so what? But what it has also done is completely changed the relationship between state and citizen, in which the citizen owns their data, and I can explain why. And then when it came to the final chapter, more the summary, I thought, where can I go that will again surprise people and encapsulate what I hope is the resilience side of things, to a city that is and a country that is a very challenged democracy, because the forces of right-wing populism are so strong. But the city I just found absolutely inspiring, and it's Timișoara, which it has an extraordinary, and dare I say it, German mayor. So that's my tour d'horizon of the countries.
Which one was your favorite?
It's such a great question, and I actually sometimes I give different answers. And I mean, just in sort of professional terms, sometimes the ones that I find most inspiring, I didn't necessarily enjoy the trip as much, and that just could be because the weather was terrible, or I don't know what, But what Canada is doing with immigration is turning the argument on its head, and I think the ones I enjoyed most were the ones that surprised me. And so Canada absolutely did surprise me with the solutions that it has come up with. And Taiwan on a number of levels, because Taiwan is so threatened, we don't know what's going to happen to Taiwan. But what they have achieved in the health service there. But I mean, at the risk of saying something incredibly sort of boring and obvious, I enjoyed each one. I had this terrible fear that I would arrive in any country, no matter how good the research that my researcher had done or I had done, and somebody would say, I don't know why you're here. This, we're terrible at doing this, and I got a little bit of that because people don't like to boast as a rule. People are generally, except in countries like Britain where they love to boast, but in generally, people are quite sort of bescheiden. They're quite humble, and they find it quite strange that people want to come and listen to and report about the secrets of their success.
Before you're going to read a bit from the introduction, maybe just as a premise, you argue that the solutions to our biggest challenges are already out there and tested, proven, transferable, and that the problem is that democratic politics has become too fearful to implement them.
Yep.
So, the premise of the book.
Yeah, I'll just read a few little short extracts from the book, because I'm really keen to, to continue the conversation with you, Bianca, and to hear from you. It's just really to give you a flavor, maybe to shortcut on some of your questions, and then, I'm just literally going to read a paragraph here and a paragraph there, which sets out the argument quite well. And it's all from the introduction of the book, some of which I may have already said, in which case I'll go through it quickly. At a time when so much of the world is enveloped in gloom, fearful of climate and health emergencies, economic decline, and the relentless rise of authoritarianism, It's time for a book that scours the globe and comes up with answers. Call it a survival kit, a way of navigating this new era. Over the past 3 years, I've gone in search of countries and cities, governments and communities which are tackling the threats that we face with imagination. No matter our culture, history, or geography, we all share similar challenges. Where am I going to live? Who will look after me when I get old or sick? Am I learning the right skills to face the challenges from artificial intelligence? Do I have trustworthy information to help me make my choices? What kind of community do I want to live in? How can my environment be protected without it costing me my livelihood? Wherever we look, someone has a lesson for us, if only we have the humility to want to learn. That's the difference between societies that are open to new influences and those that fly the flag and think they know best. Many exciting examples of good practice exist in the unlikeliest places. A decade ago, as I mentioned, I became a professional pessimist. I kept on forecasting. Anyway, I've said all this. I got the latter wrong on Le Pen, but who knows for how long. I won several bets on that. It was easy to feel smug, but it didn't improve anything. So how about trying to look for the good? My starting point is that we cannot assume things will return to the way they were. The rise of authoritarian populism has made that certain. Why is it that mainstream politicians, including those who promised so much for so long, end up doing little more than tinkering? Why do they display such learned helplessness? The key ingredient that eludes them is courage. What does courage in leadership mean? First, what it isn't. It has nothing to do with recklessness, shooting from the hip, courting short-term popularity. In this era of instant judgments and the pressure to make binary choices, that is the coward's way out. Nor is it triangulation, working out the position of the two extremes and putting yourself in the middle, constantly looking over your shoulder for any criticism from the loudest voices. Nor is it based in rhetoric. I could quote Barack Obama's audacity of hope, or Tony Blair of the 1997 variety, or John F. Kennedy, or Willy Brandt, or Nelson Mandela, or Martin Luther King. No, the courage I am talking about is muscular, reflecting the harder-edged realities of now. It is based on commitment to see something through, staying power, resilience in the face of adversity. It's about being prepared to go against the grain when necessary and being honest with your citizens. Many reforms result from war, invasion, poverty, or financial crisis, but they don't have to. Some countries have seen the need to refresh, not as the result of trauma, but in order to prepare for the future. Britain stumbles, making it up as it goes along, safe in the delusion that because it hasn't been invaded for a millennium and hasn't had a revolution for 400 years, it has no need for hard introspection. That's just one example, but I can also talk about the German variation of that. This book is a call to arms for radicalism, but not of the symbolic variety that dominates our bifurcated politics. It requires us to break out of our national straitjackets, dispense with bureaucratic inertia, and think across a wide spectrum of cultures and forms of governance. It requires political tribes to think differently, to discard shibboleths. None of this will be easy. The nativist authoritarian backlash is a response to maladministration, unfairness, and government by increment. Everywhere you look, you see liberal democratic leaders paralyzed with fear. They worry about the markets with some reason. They worry about conventional media and social media with less reason. They wait for bad things to happen, trying to anticipate what their critics might say of them in case they put a foot out of line. It's a self-fulfilling spiral. Trump's contribution has been to shake us out of our stupor, to make us realize that caution does not work. The irony is that it is the populists who tend to show greater courage, but of a different wrong kind. They don't worry about making enemies. They define themselves through their enemies. And with that provocative thought, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, John. I would actually like to start with an example right on our doorstep, so to say, Vienna. Because Vienna raises, to me, a really brutal question for German cities, and especially Berlin. Why them and not us? 60% of Vienna's population lives in subsidized, high-quality housing without social stigma. And I would really like to know, how did that happen, and how could we make it happen here? Twofold question.
Well, I mean, a lot of it did used to happen here, and it also used to happen in countries that regard themselves as very different, as sort of Anglo-Saxon, hard-edge free economics. I mean, the United States, in Roosevelt's New Deal, built huge, incredible public housing. Britain, again, which is associated with sort of Margaret Thatcher and changing the law, enabling people to buy their own council housing, used to be, in the 1950s, there was an extraordinary, and it was a conservative government that did it, an extraordinary explosion in the construction of public housing. So countries that now have gone in a different direction didn't always used to be like that. What Vienna has been consistent for 100 years. So the story after the end of the First World War was a city that was completely broken, that was full of disease, terrible poverty levels. And the social democratic government of the time, and it's still very much a social democratic, but of a very different kind of nature to the SPD here, government in Vienna, undertook then an extraordinary explosion of public housing. Now, when the Anschluss happened and the Nazis came, that was stopped, but it wasn't reversed. And when the Second World War ended, Vienna returned to what it was, which is I mean, in some ways, when you look at Vienna and the beautiful old Fantasieck buildings, you think it's an incredibly bourgeois city, in Kaffee and Kuchen, everybody going to the opera and all that kind of stuff. And in one respect, it is like that. But the explosion of public modern housing in Berlin, in Vienna, is absolutely incredible. And I was with this guy called Kurt Hofstetter, who is basically in charge of taking foreign delegations, and they go to the city offices in Vienna all the time. There's this constant procession of cities from everywhere in the world, from Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, not to mention many European cities who go to Vienna to try and understand what it is that they're doing. Now, I started the chapter quoting him, telling me a story of what happens with American delegations going to Vienna. And they have this 1 week, Monday to Friday, sort of standard tour. And they're in a hotel, and he takes them on a bus, just a charter bus, to a housing project called Sonnenwendviertel, which is in central Vienna. And he says to everybody, okay, everybody, time to get off the bus. We're going for a walk through this housing project. And he was telling me this story, and he said that the standard response among these American city officials, senior officials, mayor's office officials, American states, and others, is either to shriek or to burst into tears, or their knees start to wobble. And I said, why? He said, because they find this very idea of walking through a housing project in the middle of the day rather than being driven through a housing project really frightening. So I wrote this at the start of the book, and in each chapter I sent a draft of my chapter back to 3 or 4 of the experts who had helped me in all of the cities and countries that I had visited. And Kurt wrote back to me and said, look, you really can't write this. And I said, why? He said, because you are mocking them. You are making fun of these Americans. And that's not what I meant. What I meant was to show you that everything is about what you are used to. And these American officials they're not dumb, they're not weak, they're not sort of lacking in anything. It's a completely different culture. Anyway, so it always takes them around, and everybody is mesmerized by, and talking to architects and city planners and the deputy mayor, Catherine Gall, who's in charge of housing, and all the top architects in Vienna want to build in the public sector, not in the private sector, because that's where the prestige is, and to a large degree, that's where the money is as well. Now, it requires, and this is one of the threads of the book, along with long-termism and planning and imagination and being honest with your citizens, the things I have spoken about, it requires a high degree of social solidarity. And this is a really important point. I describe that a lot in Costa Rica, I describe that in Finland, I describe that very much in Canada as well when it comes to immigration. The sense of rights come with responsibilities. And so when you are living in a housing block, any of the different models that they have in Vienna, but some of the cooperative ones, it's not like there's a rule, but on Saturday mornings, everybody is required to use their skills to help the rest of the community, either in their block or in the wider project. So the teacher in the block helps the kids of other residents who are having difficulties. The IT expert goes around fixing people's computers. The plumber goes around fixing people's toilets. Everybody is doing something for the community, and they are also doing a lot of work with the assimilation of refugees, several of whom are in each block as well. It's trying to move away or move back to an era of, as I say, rights and responsibilities, and this sense of changing the relationship between the state and the individual, and empowering the individual to take far more responsibility with their own community, which you have here as well, but it is so much more established there, and it pretty much dominates. And if you didn't want to mitmachen, if you didn't want to be on the committee that's, so many of these buildings have you have your own kitchens and whatever else, but they also have communal kitchens. We're talking social housing here with yoga studios, jacuzzis, music rooms, children's play areas.
And affordable.
That's below the rents that you would pay in Berlin.
Mm-hmm. You were just talking now about the individual duties that come along with having that right. However, I'm still wondering, okay, you said that the system survived a century, right? It survived the Nazis, it survived economic crises, shifting political majorities. I'm wondering, how did this happen? You were talking about courage. So where did those Vienna politicians find the courage to keep up that system? You said that we had something like this here as well, and then Berlin got sold, more or less. So what did they do differently so they could sustain that?
Well, I think Berlin is quite a separate story in some ways, because of division, because of the Wende, because of two different political systems having to come together very, very quickly. So I think other examples of German cities, are possibly closer in terms of being able to analyze the similarities and the differences with Vienna. In all my chapters, I always think that there are two motivations for individuals and for communities, that if they come together, you get a greater chance of good results. One is the greater good, the thing we're talking about, and the other is self-interest. And if you can live in a bloc that's mixed, that is genuinely mixed, that isn't a place that is associated, as is very much the case now in the United States, in the UK, in the banlieue, in outside Paris, with disadvantage, with difficulty, with economic hardship. But if you can produce a housing system that is genuinely got a sense of a mixed society and a mixed economy, then everybody ultimately benefits, because crime and antisocial behavior and all other manifestations of social difficulty come down with it.
You just said the self-interest, that this is also a driver. That brings me to our next example, because I would really like to talk about that country, because it's not a typical democratic country, Morocco, which had to change its energy system because of the oil crisis. So maybe you could elaborate what Morocco did.
Yeah, I deliberately wanted to put in Morocco because if you looked at the league tables of countries with the highest proportion of renewable energy as part of their total electricity mix, you would get to places like Sweden very, very quickly. Australia is now doing pretty well, and other countries as well. But I wanted to challenge our systems by asking us this question: how do we, as democratic, hopefully liberal democratic countries, meet these bigger challenges now that go beyond the cycle of the 4-year and the 5-year election? By saying that, I'm not advocating authoritarian regimes, far from it, but we have to understand what is driving, what are the economic and social drivers, particularly in the global south, particularly among emerging powers and emerging economies, that are enabling them to catch up and overtake incredibly quickly. Now, the Moroccan story, as you say, Bianca, is this, that 2007, 2008, global financial crisis, the price of oil per barrel, a bit like it has been for a lot of the last couple of months since the attack on Iran, around $150 a barrel, which is, of course, a huge economic crisis for all the countries affected by that. And the king of Morocco said to his advisors, guys, look, this is crazy. We can't survive this. We are 95% dependent on imports of oil, of fossil fuels, and a lot of those imports are coming from countries that are unstable, including our neighbors, Algeria and Libya, not to mention Russia and elsewhere. We've got to do something about it. Now, Morocco, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know, is blessed with huge amounts of sun and wind on two coastlines. And so in some ways it wasn't difficult for them to do it, but they hadn't done it. But I mean, all European countries have either sun or wind, and some have both. Within 3 to 6 months, that country had developed a strategy, and another 3 or 6 months later, they had started to build. 15 years later, they've gone from almost zero, they had a bit of hydroelectric, but not much else, to over 50% of renewable energy in their electricity mix. You look at this country, which actually started well, and then completely stopped and was totally exposed when Putin had his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and everything that then happened, not to mention for Ukraine, but in terms of the energy market. And Robert Habeck would had to go with his begging bowl to Qatar and to other countries to get LNG and gas from other countries. So the reason I'm saying this is that whether it's environmental changes or whether it's the demographic time bomb, which is an extraordinary story, what is about to hit us, and is already hitting us, and then you throw it together with AI, we've got serious issues. Most of the problems, of the big problems that we are facing, go beyond the scale of the political debate. You know, German elections next in 2029, Länderwahlen all the time, 3 or 4 every year. So what I was trying to do with this chapter was to say we have to find a way, an all-society way of meeting these big challenges, which could be commissions of all the mainstream political parties, expert commissions, whatever else, to completely transform the way we deal with the climate emergency. And the other chapter, as I mentioned briefly, the Costa Rica example, is an incredible one where they have reversed everything the IMF told them to do, which is to chop down their rainforest and produce cheap agriculture, mainly for the United States market. So they did that. They went from 90% forestry cover to 40% in 20 years after the Second World War. Pretty much destroyed their whole ecosystem of their country. What did they find? They found that their agricultural yields, the amount of food they grew in their fields, got worse in terms of quality and quantity. The prices went down. So the economy completely flipped on its head. So they began an incredible system called payment for environmental services, which was the reforestation and paying farmers to reforest and not to harvest their fields, or to harvest only a smaller amount of fields. And they're already back up to 60%. Economic growth is absolutely booming there in a region where, surrounded by really terrible dictatorships in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and instability all over the place. And again, this hits the sweet spot of doing good, reforesting, making money, both because the quality of what agriculture they do produce now is much, much better, but also through incredible amounts of ecotourism, which has its downsides too when badly managed in certain places. But it's been an absolute boom for that country as well. So that is a model, a potential model for other countries in the emerging world.
And I also think it could be a model in parts of it for Germany, where to talk about broadly about the climate crisis, where my impression is when we talk about solutions that we could implement here, it's always about losses. And actually, if we achieved our climate goals in the cities would have had billions more of euros that would be in the economy and for the people, and many more jobs, but it seems that this is really hard to communicate. What do you think is the problem to just make a transfer to Germany, or not the problem, what could Germany do, what Costa Rica does, maybe also what Morocco does in parts? What do you think is transferable?
I mean, all my examples I would like to think are transferable. Not that you cut and paste and you just put it in another country, but you take the virtues and you take the arguments and you take some of the fiscal measures, the tax measures, and you can, in different ways in different countries, transfer them. I think it's a great tragedy that the environmental debate here and in so many similar countries has been so ridiculed in the last 10 years, to sort of woke versus not woke, and real men in America do drill baby drill, and all this sort of stuff, versus these sort of metropolitan liberal wokies who want to stop you driving your car, and all this sort of ridiculous simplifications and traducing the facts. And if we can get to a place where the investments in renewables, and not just renewables, but in all kinds of measures of energy saving, and some of you may well be environmental specialists, there is significant social cohesion and money to be made in going green, along with saving the planet along the way. We just, in my opinion, need to tell the story in a different way. And again, it's about courage. It's about saying, and this is the great tragedy, I think, of the center-left, is it's always frightened to make the argument, and it's always frightened to confront, we saw this all the time, with Olaf Scholz, to absolutely confront people, not with bifurcated conversations about principles, but just simply talk about the economic facts and what can kickstart this country's economy, what can kickstart the British economy, the French economy, the Italian economy, the Spanish economy. Well, Spain's doing all right, and others as well. A lot of the answers are radical, but some of the answers are right in front of our noses.
I think we could talk about so many more countries and so many more topics and solutions in those countries.
Can I just say something very quickly about Canada and immigration? Because it's obviously the hot topic in all the worst sense of the term, the sort of toxic topic of now. And it did actually change my opinion about immigration. And let me tell you why. There are the good people who are in favor of immigration, and there are the bad people who are against immigration. So is the paradigm. And what I learned from Canada is that's a false dichotomy. Nobody wants to be like North Korea and close the door. At the same time, nobody wants to have a system, I assume, in which anybody can arrive in any country or in the EU in terms of the external borders, any murderer, rapist, fraudster, whatever, without any checks, right? So once you've admitted that those two extremes don't exist, you're then in the realm of working out what is the best system that works. What Canada has is two things that I think broadly work. It sets a rolling 5-year level, which isn't so much a top, it's actually a target for the 5 areas of immigration, which is economic migrants, family reunions, temporary labor, students, and refugees fleeing terrible things. It sets these levels, and it has public debates for 6 months before the levels are agreed. And they talk about, what do we need? Do we have the health infrastructure? Do we have the housing infrastructure? Do we have this? Do we have that? Shall we increase the level by 50,000? Shall we bring it down by 25,000? Shall we do this? Shall we do that? And alongside that, there is this extraordinarily impressive system of sponsorship. So a housing association, a family, a church group, a company can sponsor a migrant, a group of migrants, their families, and then they are legally responsible for everything that happens to them for the first year. That includes finding them accommodation, filling their fridge, taking them to the doctors to register, taking their children to school to register, and looking after them in the broadest sense, because the social services look after them, in being the liaison for the first year. So immigration is not something that is done to a public that has no say, the technical term being input legitimacy. Because the chances are, if you wanted to be involved, you could be involved. So therefore, it brings me to this point about immigration is what works. It's what works for the original population, and it's what works for the migrant population. Because if the two are broadly in harmony, and if the original population has been brought into the conversation, then you will have far less tension between that. Which then brings me to this point about numbers. So in the Canadian sense, is 250,000 immoral? Is 500,000 moral? Is 1 million more moral? The answer is that none of them are more or less moral. It's about what works and what brings the the two communities together in the best sense of the terms of assimilation and integration and cohesion. So it made me think, and you see here with the AfD, you see in all across countries, you see with the ICE-hooded thugs in America, whatever, you see the battle lines on immigration being drawn. And in my view, it's a pure sign of a failed system in which people have not been involved in the conversation from an early stage. And Canada shows, and Canada's not the only country, but I do think it's the best example I can find, that if you bring people into the conversation and you involve them in it, you can achieve, again, this combination of self-interest and the greater good.
Yeah, and also I think to add for Canada, many people do those sponsorships. They're interested in meeting those people in, what's the word in English, begleiten, accompany those people. Yeah. It's not that it's, oh no, it's a burden to do. It's actually what it's ingrained, it seems to be, in the society. There are more people that want to
do it than the organizations coordinating it are able to you know, I was talking to one organization based in a church, and she cannot handle the number of people, of residents, who want to sponsor migrants.
Yeah, and the result is Canada is a ultra-diverse nation.
Yeah, the city of Toronto does its public information in 180 languages. And I didn't know there were 180 languages, but anyway, and I'm sure it's all done by AI now, by DeepL Pro or something. But still, I think it's still pretty amazing.
Well, thanks for bringing up that very important chapter. I guess the rest you will have to read. John will sign some books, and now we have time for maybe 2 questions, if there are any questions. Yes, please. Is there a microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. Does it work? Yes. Okay. My question was about Canada, because before we also mentioned self-interest. About the sponsorship program, do the people that apply for sponsorship get anything in return, or is it just because they are volunteer? Just volunteer? Yeah. Okay.
That's an easy one to answer.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
But it's also about, what's the right term? It's not social respectability, that sounds the wrong term. It's sort of mitmachen. It's a sort of sense of you do it because that's what your community expects of you. And we don't have time to go in it, but my chapter on Finland and the education system, the reason that, well, there are many reasons why that system works, but the most amazing one is the social status of teachers, and the pay for teachers is no better than the European average, it's about the same. But the sense of, oh my God, you're a teacher, that is incredible, you know, thank you, thank you, thank you. And there are so many, you have to have a master's degree at least, probably a doctorate, and then 2 years working in the general community, and then you apply 2 or 3 times until you get in, right? So is the desire to belong to a profession that is so socially valued. So it comes back to this whole point that I was seeking to make around that sense of the value of human endeavor in a community. If you can create, and it's not just down to politicians, it's down to us as well, if you can create environments in which actions like that are valued, then you do change the dynamic.
One last quick question, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I found it very inspiring, and I kept on thinking how to create this kind of transformation. You mentioned a few points at the end, because I feel you mentioned the importance of involvement, of public participation. In my personal experience, whether it's in politics or in corporate world, people in power, they decide for the short-term gain. They're a little bit afraid to go the path of involvement because they may be afraid to be transparent. Maybe they are afraid that they will be exposed, that they will maybe lose time or lose power, lose control. So they choose the short-term way to extract the most benefits and maybe go and leave or something. So what is your opinion? How do you create this kind of transformation?
John, you have 30 seconds.
Well, thank you for saying that, because that is absolutely, that was one of the extracts I could have read in the introduction. If our politicians continue down this path of short-term incrementalism, doing not very much slowly, I'm absolutely convinced our system is finished. That our democracies and the sort of post-1945 settlement is over. Because I think because the challenges are so great, the demographic, the climate, the skills challenge of AI, the stuff that we are facing, and the stuff that the next generation of kids coming through from the age of 18 in every country are so enormous that if our politicians don't think differently and don't think more long-term and don't think beyond the next election or beyond the next Parteitag or whatever it is, I think these systems, this is the, I promise I would leave you optimistic, but this is the pessimistic side of it. These systems will collapse, and they will deserve to collapse, in my opinion, because the other side, the baddies, have a ready-made, it's completely false, but a ready-made set of rhetorical statements that are so attractive. If we cannot find this imagination, this risk-taking within our politicians from center-left to center-right, then I really think we're in a deep trouble, which is why, and certainly the response I've got from politicians in all kinds of places, and economists and policymakers, is quite is encouraging, because I think they really, you know, to use an old American phrase, wake up and smell the coffee.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you very much for being here, and goodbye.
Oh,